Before beginning and launching into lecture, I thought it's possibly helpful to provide some context and background to what Keith has just said by way of introduction. And this will no doubt make my father chuckle, because on arriving home after parents' evening, it was never a happy place to be in our house. It was if you were my brother or sister, because they were very well behaved and worked hard. I, on the other hand, was the third child. I'll just select two out of many that I could have looked at by way of references in my school reports. This is from my primary school, just to prove that there was some consistency to my behaviour over the years in my early education. He, Neil, has a very vivid imagination, but seldom expresses it to his full. Most of the time, his work looks untidy. Neil could do much better if only he didn't talk so much and concentrated a little more. That was from my primary education. I'll select one again. My father will appreciate this one, not least because it was written by somebody who ultimately is probably holds a significant hand in the fact that I now do something like what I do. And it was from my old chemistry master. This is from my fourth year in senior school. My chemistry master, Mr. Clark, who was formidable. I was terrified of Mr. Clark. But when we got to sixth form options evening, Sid was head of sixth form, and I thought I should go and see him and explain what I was preparing to do. And as I walked to his chair and desk at the parents' evening, he just looked up at me and went, "Fowler, you're not doing chemistry." Which is probably why I ended up as a biomechanist, because I clearly wasn't allowed to do chemistry. This is Sid's take on me during my fourth year. His test results show that when he makes the effort, he has the capability to do well, but generally his work shows a cheerful willingness to do the least possible and avoid painful thought. In the days when school reports called it as it really was. It was reports of that nature that eventually, when I did get to make the decision and go to university, at the end of my first term at university, when I was struggling desperately to finish the first term's assignments so I could go home for Christmas, it struck me that actually I was quite enjoying this stuff. And it was quite good fun, and maybe I had found the thing that made me tick. And that's going to feature in some of what I want to unpack for you tonight. Because as the title suggests, it's an interdisciplinary look at back pain. That is the area where I spent quite a lot of my years researching. And I'm sure is interesting to many people, not least looking around the room and the demographics, setting aside those who might be sitting in the front row. But for those over the age of 30, about 50% of you will experience back pain in any given year. And over the population, about 80% of us will suffer from back pain. But it's not just an over 30s problem. Back pain affects people at any age. It's not all related to aging, but many of us do experience episodes of back pain. And I hope during the course of this evening to explain to you some of what I've learned about back pain. The spoiler alert, there's no magic remedy. If you have back pain, you're not going to leave here with the answer and make it go away. But hopefully you may understand a little bit more about the journey of that back pain and what may cause it, but also explain some of what goes on in the treatment regime, why it gets managed in the way that it does, and why some things are successful and some things are not. So we'll explore some of those avenues as we go through this evening. But I also want to draw from that some of the lessons that I've learned about doing research. Because my research journey and my interest in back pain provides an opportunity to go, how could you apply that in other research settings? What might this mean generally for the way in which research would, could, and should be conducted? And because, as my school reports indicate, I've always liked to challenge and worked hard at what's set before me. I want to add a third narrative thread to tonight's presentation, and that's to relate it to what I am now responsible for, which is learning and teaching. And it does draw from those original school reports of, how did I, somebody who was a bit of an oaf at school, and didn't really get it and pull their socks up until rather late in the day, how am I now responsible for the learning and teaching of so many people across higher education in the UK? It's a little bit scary. Well, how's that informed my philosophy for learning and teaching, and just my learning approach and what drives me in terms of learning and teaching, which will come as a shock to my children who had to endure homework time and primary school maths, where they might not see what I described tonight as having been played out in their lived experience, where I may not have been quite so gentle in my approach, that learning is about curiosity and interest, and it was just do your times tables. Did possibly feature in my approach to early education. I've moved on since then, kids, not honest. So that's what I'm going to seek to try to do during the course of this evening, and hopefully we'll pick up those themes and you'll see bits of the narrative as they unfold on that journey through. And finally, by way of introduction, I have got two of my children with us here, others listening online. And just for once, I can turn around, because so many of our conversations at home include the phrase, "Dad, I didn't ask for a lecture," as I'm about 10 minutes into asking a fairly simple question that had been posed to me. Well, tonight you did. And you might have questions at the end, but you're not getting another lecture. You only get one for the price of one tonight. So, where did it all begin? I did begin as an exercise and sports scientist. I was once young and gangly and stupid looking, rather than old, gangly and stupid looking, as I have now become an undergraduate student. In my first year, became a little bit more studious and had some hair. This is proof I did once have hair, for those of you, well, I've got the hat on so you can't see my baldness. And my graduation in Liverpool Cathedral with my dad, and this is just slightly shocking how much I have become the photograph of my father. Or I have to say, if any of you get the opportunity to talk to my dad later on, he's very good to talk to. If I can become 10% of the man that my father is, I'll be very proud and pleased to have become that person. So the fact that I look a bit like him, I'll take that, because he's a bit awesome, my dad. All right, that undergraduate journey and my journey into research, inspired by the two individuals who also appear on the slides, Professor Adrian Lees, who was the principal supervisor of my PhD work, and Professor Tom Riley, who's one of the fathers of exercise and sports science. And I had the pleasure to share an office with Tom for about 18 months when I first started my PhD work. And he's just an incredible mind and understanding of the subject, and it's just a polymath in terms of the things that Tom knew, understood, and was able to teach. So those two individuals as early inspirations for the work that I went on to do, and I must call them out at this point. So I did a PhD. I finished my undergraduate studies, as Keith said. I got offered a PhD opportunity, and that PhD was to look at the efficacy of plyometric training, which I'm not going to talk about at all this evening. If anybody does want to talk plyometrics, I will happily do that on another occasion. Essentially, my PhD involved sitting people in this torture device and smacking them into a wall for 3 years, which was tremendously good fun. But it was the methods that I utilised whilst doing that. I was trying to compare two different ways of training: traditional jump training and being smacked into a wall, which took the gravitational elements out of the movement. And I was comparing the movement patterns of looking at the efficacy of the training, how well did it work, what did it do in terms of muscle performance, etc. But plyometric training has a reputation for being potentially rather injurious. And so one of the aspects that I looked at within the PhD work was the injury risk associated with that jump-based training. And that led me into looking at the loading on the spine. And a technique known as stadiometry. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the method particularly, but it takes us into the notion we can use measurements of the spine to tell us something about the loading on the body, and the link between how much we're experiencing load during daily activities and the behavior of the discs within the spine. And so stadiometry is this method of measuring the length of the whole body to look at changes that are going on in the spine. Now, so I'm not particularly going to unpack it. We use that as a method throughout many of the studies that I'm going to talk about tonight, but it gives us the link to the anatomy bit. Because we can't do a session and a lecture on back pain without first understanding some of the basics of what the spine is and how it works. Again, you're not going to be tested on the anatomy at the end. There's just a few key points of this that you need to grasp in order to understand what's going on in this exploration of back pain. As a piece of design, if you wanted to work out how to get the most important organ of the body, mostly this thing, the brain that helps us think, and we want to keep that safe after we've decided that walking upright's a good thing to do rather than wandering around on all fours, putting it atop a stack of 20 plus bricks is probably not the design engineering solution you would think is the smartest one. So about 5% of your body mass contained within the head stacked up on a bunch of bricks. Not a great design. Depending how you choose to count them, there are between 22 and 33 bones that make up the spine. I don't care which one of those numbers that you're interested in, because tonight, what we're really interested in is the bottom ones, the lower 5 vertebrae, because they do most of the work. Because it's a stack of bricks in which we've got all of the weight of the body sitting on top of these lumbar discs. And the further up you go, the lighter the weight gets, because there's less bricks left on top of it in order to contribute to that. And so we've got this bony stack that is basically like a pile of bricks that get gradually smaller as we go on up. And the vertebral bodies, these parts at the front, bear the bulk of that weight. And so we have the vertebral body. If we push this, does it make a little razor thing come on? It does. So the vertebral body here, this is the weight-bearing bit of the disc, of the spine. It holds the load. And then we've got these pokey out bits, technical anatomical term, the pokey out bits that we use for attaching ligaments, muscles, tendons to it to allow movement to take place. You need sticky out bits to attach bits to. Flat bits aren't great for attaching things to. And because they stick out a little bit, they can create some leverage. So they're a bit further away from the joint, so they make movement a little bit easier. If we just had the bony bits next to each other, movement is a little bit more difficult. So if we imagine our proxies of 2 vertebral bodies, if they just sit like this, it's quite hard to move them. You can move them, but it's a limited amount of movement that you can create. If we have an intervertebral disc, this is where I'm making a mess, sat between our vertebral bodies, it separates them, and they can move more easily. Oh, it's just about in the right place. So that's why we have the intervertebral disc, because the intervertebral discs sit in between the vertebra to facilitate greater movement. The other thing that the intervertebral disc does is they absorb some of the load. So they serve a purpose of being a shock absorber between the individual discs, and they carry some of the load that's going through the body in order to help reduce the bone-on-bone contact that we would see. And anybody in the room who's got 50-plus-year-olds' knees knows what bone-on-bone loading feels like. It's not wonderful. It hurts a little bit, because that's what you start to get is your joints get a bit older, and you get a bit of degradation of the cartilaginous material, and you get a bit of bone-on-bone. It's not nice. So the intervertebral discs stop that from happening. They get in the way, and they keep the bones apart from each other. As you will have noticed from the earlier part of the demonstration, the intervertebral disc is full of water. Not literally full of water in the way that my sponge was, but figuratively so. The disc itself is a little bit like a car tire, in that we have a series of annular fibers. So the walls of the disc are like the walls of your tire. You can see the wires go crisscross around them. That's what the fibers supporting the wall of the disc are like. And then within it, the nucleus, like the yolk of an egg, sits in the middle of the disc, slightly harder, less compressible substance within the middle of the disc. When you load the disc, and we put some body weight upon it, and we get another intervertebral disc and we put another bit of body weight on it, you can see that the discs compress. They lose some of their height. The bottom disc is more squidged than the one above it because it's got twice as much weight upon it. And if we put another one on top of that, there would be more weight, and the bottom one would get even more squidged than it is at the moment. So each one of our discs carries some weight. We'll see how long that stays there before it falls over. Because it's not going to compress evenly. But you can see the difference. You can see there's some change in height. And if I leave it there long enough, gradually the disc will continue to compress and water will continue to get pushed out of it. So there's two phases to the behavior of the disc. There's an immediate elastic loading. As soon as you put something on it, it squidges. Just like when you sit on a bicycle, when you first sit on your bicycle, you can see the tires squidge a little bit. If you sat on the bicycle for a very long time, gradually the air would seep out as the fluid seeps out from the disc. And over the course of the day, the disc continues to lose height. So those of you who are conscious about how tall you are, my darling wife, you're about 2 centimeters tall the first thing in the morning. So if you're conscious of wanting to have a nice high body height and you want people to think that you're nice and tall, then measure yourself within the first half an hour after getting out of bed, and you will get a much better reading than if you do it in the evening, by which point you will have shrunk by somewhere just north of 1% of your standing height. And depending how active you've been during the day, that might be even more. So your discs shrink, and as your discs shrink, you get shorter because you've got them all the way up through your spine, and everyone loses a little bit of height, and collectively that gives you the change in stature that we were measuring when we went back here to stadiometry. So that stadiometry, that measure of the length of the body, gives us an index of the change in height of the discs that make up your spine. Just because I like to make people feel uncomfortable. Just because I think it will be interesting and informative to you to learn something about the behavior of the disc. As you change posture, so that yoke, the nucleus pulposus within the disc, moves. It changes the pressure across the disc. So as we see in the top diagram, if you move the body into a flexed position, so sort of picture C, you can see the bodies move forward. We put the spine into this sort of position. You compress the disc at the front, you extend the disc at the back, and we get a pressure gradient between the front and the back of the disc. That causes, over time, the nucleus to migrate. It gradually floats backwards and adopts a new position towards the back of your disc rather than the middle of the disc where it started. It's one of the contributors to why, after you've been doing a forward flexion task, if you've been out in the garden or doing some decorating and you spend any amount of time in this sort of position and you come back up to standing, you have that wonderful crunchy, squidgy feeling in your back, because as you come up, the posterior part of your disc is no longer as compressible because it's now got the yokey bit stuck in the wrong place, and you need some time for it to migrate backwards. Those changes, those slow phase changes of the position of the nucleus within the disc, as well as the disc losing height, you change its load-bearing characteristics. And that causes a shift in the load and potentially damage to the disc. Now, we can't talk about discs without touching upon the notion of the slipped disc. They don't slip. They don't really go anywhere. It's really a herniation. It's a bulge. It's a sticky out bit of your disc. And we can see in the picture just over here, it's a normal disc where you've got the nucleus nicely in the middle. If you damage the walls of the disc, if you damage the annular fibers, then they get weaker. And if you're one of those drivers who has a bit of a habit of bumping their tires into the curb whilst parking, and weakening the wall of the tire, you will have seen some people whose tires have little bulgy, sticky out bits in the side wall of the tire where they bumped them once or twice too often into the curbs as they've been driving. That's just a weakening of the wall of the tire. It's a weakening of the fibers. The tire hasn't popped, but it's become weaker. And as a consequence of that weakness, the insides can start to become outsides. And so we get a herniation. We get the disc bulging out, the nucleus bulges out. And because it bulges into the space where the nerves come out through the spine to serve the other parts of the body, you can get the referred pain and the back pain that often we find radiating down into the hip, into the hamstring, and possibly all the way down into your calf and your lower leg, depending where in the spine that protrusion is happening. I'm not really talking about that sort of back pain tonight. So if you've got herniated discs and you were going to hope I was going to solve your herniated discs, sorry, I'm not. They're horrible. They hurt. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about dealing and managing your pain will be helpful. That sort of disc damage isn't the sort that we were particularly interested in or looking at within our research. The other thing that's worth your while knowing, seeing as you're sitting on the sort of the not most ergonomically designed chairs in the world, is that the pressure in the disc very much depends upon the position that you're in. And if you're sitting in a slightly slouchy position, as many of you may well be because you've got a very flat seat, and that tends to lift your knees and therefore tilt your pelvis backwards. As your pelvis tips backwards, so your spine goes into effectively lumbar flexion. And if you're sitting in a nice slouch, you can't really demonstrate this in a big robe, sorry. If you're sitting in this slightly slumpy position where your hips drop backwards and your spine curves this way, basically you're in this position, you just don't notice it because your legs are underneath you. That means your nucleus is migrating backwards whilst you're sitting there doing that. But actually the load through your spine in that position is about 1.5 times as great as it would be if you were standing up. So sitting down can be worse for you than standing up. And my top piece of advice when I've been asked about, everybody's now sitting up nice and straight, pelvis. My top piece of advice when asked about the ergonomics of seating position is buy yourself the most uncomfortable seats you can possibly find, for the simple reason is it makes you get out of it. And not being in your seat is the best way to sort out problems with back pain caused by sitting down. Don't move. Just move is the most important thing that you can do. Your back loves you when you move. It doesn't like you when you stay still. So whilst you're sitting there, just think, some pelvis, nice and neutral in the middle, sit up straight, you'll be lovely. By the end of the talk, your disc won't have gone wandering about too much. One last bit of anatomy, because it's important in terms of the origins of pain. As our discs compress, pressing nicely in front of us as we speak, the load has to go somewhere. When it's nice and inflated, the disc works like a shock absorber. It's carrying some of that load for us. And like a balloon, you load it and it squidges a little bit. And it absorbs some of that load for us. It holds some of that energy within the fibers of the disc. It stores energy. As the disc becomes a little more flaccid, I thought I'd get the word flaccid into a serious lecture. As you become a little more flaccid, the disc squashes more, which means A, it protrudes more and more likely to impinge upon those nervy structures because it's got to go somewhere. As it loses height, as it loses volume, it gets smaller and it has to squidge more. So the softer your disc, the less inflated it is, the more it's going to squidge, the more it will bulge out of the sides. And again, anybody who's ever ridden on a bike with deflated tires knows how unstable that becomes. So if your disc is less stable, if it's more protruding, it's more likely to impinge upon the nerve root spaces and give you the referred pain that we've been talking about. It's less stable, which means the muscular ligamentous structures have to work harder to maintain the stability of this stupid pile of bricks that we've decided to stick our head upon. So as the disc compresses, as we lose height, as we become less stable, we have to work harder on the other structures, either actively through greater muscle contraction or passively through greater load going through your ligamentous structures to support the endpoint. The other structure that can often give rise to back pain, and this is the sort of back pain that you're more likely to experience later in the day. So those of you who are fine in the morning, but if you've been up and about for a long while, you start to feel a bit backache in the second half of the day, that's more likely to be pain that's associated with these bony joints that we see between the vertebrae on the sticky out bits, the facet joints. These are the joints that either enable or limit the movement of the spine. But as the discs compress, so those joints come under greater load. And they take more of that load. If they're taking more of the load, they've got more force going through them, and that's what gives rise to the facet joint pain and why it gets worse as the day goes on, because they get squidged together more, and we get more bone-on-bone loading as the day progresses. First thing in the morning, when you wake up, your discs are fully engorged with fluid, and you feel a little stiff. No making up your own jokes. But you wake up in the morning, you feel a little bit stiff because of this engorgement of the discs, and movement is more limited. You can't move around as much in the morning. You might find you have back pain first thing in the morning because of that greater stiffness. You feel more stiff in the morning. Give it 10, 15 minutes. The discs will begin to lose some height and you'll feel that you've got more mobility. So if you're one of those we like to exercise in the morning type people, strange animals that you may be, but if you do like to do some exercise first thing in the morning, sit up, give yourself 10, 15 minutes of just sitting up before you start to do anything too dynamic, and that will allow the discs to lose a little bit of height, and then you can actually start to exercise without loading too much. That's the anatomy bit. So what did we do? Well, I've been interested in looking at loading, and we've been measuring changes in stature during a variety of loading tasks, not particularly looking at back pain, just looking at a variety of ergonomic tasks. We've done some evaluation work on postmasters and looking at different kinds of carrying post bags and what that did and different sports activities. And we did a study looking at the changes in stature, changes in spinal loading during pregnancy. And we tracked a group of participants through the 3 trimesters of their pregnancy. And we know that pregnancy and back pain are closely linked, mainly because of the growth of a whole human being in a sort of not particularly ergonomically great position. Oh, let's carry a whole new load of weight around in front of us, out here, way in front of your spine, rather than nice and close to the point of loading. It might make much more sense for the baby to be carried over your shoulders. But anatomically, that's probably not a great look. So babies grow here, we get bigger, that causes a bigger forward motion and a greater compressive loading. And we were just interested in these changes in spinal behavior during pregnancy. And we came across a chance finding that as we were measuring the changes in stature, we noticed there was a difference in the behavior of the spine amongst those who had back pain and those who didn't. And that's what set us on the pathway of looking at back pain and shrinkage in back pain. Now, one of the first studies that we did was, okay, well, how much can you shrink the disc? There have been quite a lot of studies looking at spinal shrinkage during loading. So we did a study where we brought participants in and we tracked them over a 24-hour period. So we got our participants arrived 10 o'clock in the morning, that they came to see us. We measured them every 20 minutes for the first part of the day and then set them off on the duties, came back to us at 10 o'clock at night, and then we monitored them throughout the evening. And we get the 2 lines that we see on the graph here. One is our group with chronic low back pain, and the other is a group of controlled participants with no reported back pain. And they both show a fairly similar pattern of spinal shrinkage and recovery during the course of the day. We did notice that within our back pain group that they plateaued out. They reached a point where they can't shrink anymore earlier in the day, which we decided was probably related to the characteristics of the disc and a little bit of disc degeneration. It loses its capacity to absorb load and becomes a little less mobile during the course of the day. So that was our first observations. First time people have really found any differences between back pain sufferers and people without back pain. But we're also interested in, okay, but is that as much? Is that as much shrinkage as you're able to achieve? And so we stuck a 10% loaded vest on top of our control participants. We didn't do that with the back pain sufferers. Ethics committee weren't going to let us go there. And we found that actually you can keep on shrinking. The healthy disc will carry on shrinking a lot more than we see during the loss in the day. So if you're more active, you'll shrink more, but it's okay because your body can take it. So we found this. It was interesting. It was a 24-hour study, so involved quite a lot of sleeping in the lab, which was a bundle of laughs on a high jump mat in the lab. Participants got a proper bed. I didn't. And then we went on and we started looking at back pain more seriously. And part of the methodology that we use and had been used in stadiometry for a long time is before you do the first measurement, to sort of accommodate differences in behavior before they arrive at the lab, you get the participants to lie down for 20 minutes. It neutralizes loading on the spine. You get a little bit of acute loading. We measure the stature at the beginning. Then you do the thing that we're interested in, measure again at the end, and we can see the change in stature, this loss in stature that we see. And then, just because we were vaguely interested in it, we lay our participants down afterwards. We did another 20 minutes of unloading. And lo and behold, unsurprisingly, most of them regained virtually all of the height that they'd lost during the exercise. So it's acute phase loading. So if we take our brick off the disc, it will come back to its natural height and regain its stature reasonably quickly after that loading. No great surprise there. We then looked at our low back pain group. They shrank about the same amount. There wasn't a discernible difference in the amount that they shrank. But we did notice that they differed in how much they recovered. Nobody had looked at this before. I said, oh, why not? And if the disc is staying compressed, if it's not recovering after exercise, then it's spending more time in a compressed state. So all of those other structures are being loaded more, and that might explain why we're seeing the back pain that these participants had. So we started to investigate why. Why is the disc not recovering? And we began by thinking, well, if it's down to the mechanics of the disc, where you have to take the discs out and measure them, you're not getting many participants. Because most people object to that sort of thing going on. So we started looking at other things. We looked, well, it could be explained, but if there's more muscle activity, then would that explain why the disc isn't recovering? Because the muscles are staying active. And there was some research that suggested there was chronic muscle tonicity, so this chronic low-grade muscle activity in people with back pain. So we studied, we looked again at a group of people with back pain, and they shrank about the same, and we saw the same pattern of not recovering. So the graph on the left, the line that gets back towards zero is on non-pain participants. The line beneath it is the people with chronic pain, and they don't recover after exercise. And we measured the muscle activity in the muscles of the spine, and lo and behold, those with back pain had higher levels of resting muscle activity. This is whilst they're resting, doing nothing post-exercise. They have more muscle activity. We might have found a mechanism. So we were then interested in, okay, well, that's lovely. That could just be a chance finding, though. It could just be those two things both happen, but they've got no relation to each other. So we had a theory of change. We had something that said these should be linked, but we didn't know if they were really true. And even if they were linked, did they have anything to do with the pain, or did they just happen to be coterminal with the other thing that was happening? So we got our bunch of healthy control participants, and we measured them, and the top line is them. Normally they shrink and then they grow again. And then we put some electrical stimulators on their spine, and we zapped the muscles. So we made their muscles contract. And anybody who's ever got one of these passive exercise machines, the ab trainers that you put on, it makes the muscles contract whilst you just sit there and have a gin. This is what normally happens in our house. That muscle activity, electrically stimulated muscle activity, we did that to our participants, and they became like our pain patients. They didn't recover. So by stimulating muscle activity, we're able to say, oh, right, so muscle activity is linked to the failure of the spine to recover. But we're still left pretty much with a so what? Is it relevant? Can we change it? Is it linked to the pain? And why have they got this elevated muscle activity? We still haven't got to the root to it. We've noticed that you have, but why have you? What's going on to lead to it? So we carried on going. And it led us into thinking about the biopsychosocial, say that often, Jim, model of pain, which does pretty much what it says on the tin. It looks at both the biological, the social, and the psychological factors that influence pain and the way in which they interact with each other. And there are some known psychological risk factors that are associated with people with chronic pain. They include, but are not limited to, anxiety, catastrophizing, fear of movement, and depression. They're much more common findings in people with chronic pain than those without. So we looked in a low back pain population, a clinical back pain population. Now we've gone on from people who just had back pain to looking at clinical populations. And we looked at a clinical group and thought, is there a link between your levels of muscle activity and the amount of pain? And is there a link between the amount of muscle activity and how disabled you report? And we found that there was. that those who had greater levels of pain did have high levels of muscle activity. And they did have high levels of disability associated with that pain. So we're starting to build up a picture that there might be a link. We also looked at whether changes in stature and changes in muscle activity were in any way linked to any of these psych factors. And we started to find that they were. There was a link between stature recovery and catastrophizing. And when we looked at pre and post intervention, so participants on a pain management program, which is mainly CBT based, if you go onto pain management programs, they don't do anything about your pathology. They're not fixing your back. They're changing the way in which you cope with the pain that you're experiencing. And we found that the changes in anxiety, the changes in pain were related to stature recovery and ENG. So we're starting to create a link now between the psychological and the physiological characteristics of loading. And there's another bit of serendipity as we went along the way. One of my colleagues, who was also working with the shooters at the time, was interested in one of Eysenk's theories. Eysenk, one of the leading psychologists in this field of anxiety. And Eysenk was sort of looking at factors, and he found there was an interaction between social desirability, defensiveness, and anxiety. And he created these four quadrants, high and low anxious, people with high and low anxiety, funnily enough, on that axis. And then the interrelationship of that with defensiveness. When in the sporting population, the sports population is full of repressors. People who actually experience relatively high levels of anxiety, but they don't report that they do. So they naturally repress their anxiety symptoms. They're self-deceivers in terms of what they're physiologically experiencing. They're not fibbing, they're just self-deceivers in terms of what's going on. And the defensive high anxious group who experience the opposite. They're hyper-vigilant to the pain-related stimuli, or also anxiety-related stimuli in Eysenk's work. So we happened to, because they were being looked at, we chucked in the defensiveness questionnaire into our psych evaluations. And when we looked at the populations, we looked at the control population, we looked at our pain-based population, we found that about 30% of the pain treatment group were defensive high anxious. They're about as rare as rocking horse droppings in the general population, but they're disproportionately represented in the pain management group. And if we think about the pathways to pain, if we think about the nice guidelines for managing back pain, and the truth is that most non-specific mechanical back pain will get better after 6 weeks, regardless of what you do. You can stick a candle in your ear. You can rub musk behind your nose. I'm not totally sure you can rub stuff behind your nose. You can do what you like. You're probably going to get back better in 6 weeks. It really doesn't matter. It's just going to sort itself out. For some people, their pain becomes chronic. That pain doesn't go away. We don't really understand that journey from acute pain to chronic pain. It's not previously really been understood. But in order to get onto a pain management program, you go to a doctor, you're suffering from back pain, they will refer you to any one of a number of the treatments that are allowed within the NICE guidelines. And that does include just about anything. Acupuncture, physical therapy, exercise classes, all have been shown to have a positive impact on back pain. Mostly because if you did nothing, you would get better anyway. And so it's really hard to differentiate the effectiveness of different types of treatment. If you want to get onto a clinical pain pathway, you have to go back and back and back. And it is a tortuous journey for chronic pain sufferers. They get passed from pillar to post. They go through treatment to treatment to treatment that is ineffective and not relieving their symptoms before eventually they will make it onto a pain management program where they'll start to get some psychological intervention to help them manage with their pain. So it's probably not that surprising that our defensive high anxious group are overrepresented, because they are dispositionally inclined to A, be hyperattentive to their symptoms and to interpret those symptoms in a negative manner. And they are predestined to be persistent in the health system. They will go back. And so it's not a big surprise, but this had never been found before in terms of looking at this defensiveness characteristic as differentiating those in chronic pain and those without. Interestingly, in our earlier studies, if we look at those change in pain, change in scores, you see the 0 is not on the left-hand side of the scale. The 0 is somewhere near the middle. Quite a lot of people on these programs don't get better. And so we're interested, is there a difference between the responders and the non-responders, those who do get better and those don't? Unsurprisingly, again, we found that the defensive high anxious group were disproportionately represented in the group who don't respond to basic CBT interventions because they're not addressing the underlying issues that these patients have. So we looked at, well, is this to do with the biases? The psychological biases that you have, we all have dispositional biases according to our personality types. And attentional bias is one of those. Again, I won't go too much into the methodology. We used dot probe studies. We're looking at eye movements. We did little cameras looking at where are you looking at on your eyes. And we presented participants with a neutral image and a pain-invoking image. The neutral image, you can see on the left, is just a shadow. The picture on the right, somebody bending over. If you're a back pain sufferer, that's a pain-invoking image. And we checked that out. There's validated scales that these pictures do invoke more valence in those people with pain and those without. Do the same things with spiders and snakes and things for other types of fear. And depending on where you're looking will depend how quickly you're able to then respond to the stimulus that then comes afterwards. And so you look at the reaction time as well as the dwell time of the eyes during the activity. And so we did these studies. We looked at our defensive high anxious group and compared to all of the other personality types, the defensive high anxious group have an attentional bias to the threat-related images. They were much more likely to focus on the pain-evoking image than they were the neutral or positive images. So if you're doing a physical therapy intervention, you're trying to do a pacing activity, you're trying to teach them movement education, where's the patient going to look? Are they going to look at the thing you're demonstrating is saying to them, or are they going to look at where the pain stimulus is and focus upon the pain stimulus? And then we wonder whether or not they'll get the same benefit from that intervention. So we've identified a potential causal link all the way back to the personality type of the individuals, back through to the muscle activity that evokes, back to the behavior of the disc, and back to the loading of the structures that are the cause of the pain. So we've been on a journey that started looking at the mechanics of discs and forces and loads, evolved into looking at physiological response with muscle activity, and ended up on the doormat of psychology, personality type, and eye movement. So depending upon your disposition, will probably determine upon how you will respond to the pain stimulus that you get, and why some individuals will not benefit from just giving them CBT because you're not addressing the underlying problems that are there, whilst other people will. And the question that we're left with at this stage, and we'd love to take the research in its next steps, is, okay, well, could we use that to better stream participants? If we looked at these personality characteristics at the start of somebody's pain journey, could we save some of the pain and suffering these individuals go through on the pathway where they're getting treatment after treatment that isn't going to work? And could we direct them more rapidly onto an attention bias modification program that will allow us to change those biases, change the attentional focus, and therefore allow the participant to be on a pathway that would alleviate some of the psychological symptoms that cause them to suffer the pain that they have, whilst making sure that physical therapy interventions, CBT interventions, are targeted upon those participants who've got the best chance of benefiting. And we clean up the pathways. We make it more efficient, save cost, save pain and suffering on the individuals who are on those pain pathways. That's where we'd love to take the work. So it's been a research journey that started with exercise, moved through discs, muscles, eyes, brains, and lots of questions. And so there's this element that to me, the research journey, what does this tell me about research and research philosophy as a whole? Well, fundamentally, it's all about the questions. It's all about never being satisfied with the answer to the question that you've got, but sort of recognizing that research is really about finding out what was the question you should have asked in the first place, because the one you just asked was stupid. And every bit of research leads to more questions than it does to answers, because we just realized that we weren't asking the right thing in the first place. And if ever you do a research study where it gives you the answer, publish it, write a book, retire. Because everything else you do thereafter is going to be frustrating as hell, because no other research will get you there. But more importantly, I think, It's about being open to the serendipitous moments. It's about being open to paradigm shifts. It's about being open to new knowledge. If I'd approached the study of back pain as a purely mechanical construct, we wouldn't have found any of the things that we found. If I'd stuck in the world of physiology and muscle activity, we never would have ventured into understanding the psyche and the behavioral characteristics and what's going on in the dispositional area. And I would remain frustrated at my inability to differentiate between the findings that I was getting off different groups of people. There's nothing like participants to bugger up a good research study because they just don't always behave the way you would like them to do. So we have to keep probing and going, why? Why is it different? What's happening? Who does this work for? When does it work? Why is it different in some situations? And just accepting those serendipitous moments of just discovering a couple of patients who developed back pain in the middle of their pregnancy and changed their spinal behavior. And we sort of thought, oh, that's interesting. Those people are now behaving differently. I wonder if everybody else does that. And somebody happens to be looking at shooters and I think staring, going, oh, we could measure that because we're doing the other measures along here. And just letting those joyfulest, serendipitous moments take you down paths that you never would have thought to follow. Be open. Don't stick in your paradigm. If you stay in your paradigm, you're never going to get to the answer. You'll only ever find a very narrow view of the world that you occupy. But it also, to me, takes me back to my approach to learning and teaching and what should be going on. And that journey from being the slightly oikish, talks too much and doesn't really put enough effort into his work at school, to somebody who's now standing in front of a group of people giving a professorial lecture. And it's that notion that in education, we spend far too much time trying to teach people what they need to know. Whereas really education should be about teaching people how to be consciously curious, how to build a wonder and excitement of wanting to go and find the answer to the question, to be that person who, when they hear something, goes, I wonder why that is. And then sits on Google and starts to research it and starts to go, well, how do I find that out then? And what does that mean? And oh, I wonder if that's related to this. And that joy and journey of education being about exciting, about being 4-year-old again. And just going, why? As I said so, why? Yeah, why do we drive that out of our children? It's the most important question that we ever do. So, yeah. Embrace your inner 4-year-old. University education is about trying to drive out of students the education that they've experienced on their pathway through high school. Sorry, the teachers in the room. Where they've been rammed full of facts and been told to regurgitate them, and trying to invoke in them a joy for wanting to learn the stuff that we need to learn. So ditch the content. It's not about what you put in your course. It's about the opportunities, the skills, equipping students to ask the right questions and to step outside of the paradigm in their search for the answers. Learning should be about wanting to know the answers, not about providing the answers. We shouldn't be providing knowledge. We should be providing curiosity. So for me, they're the two take-home messages. Be curious, embrace serendipity, go with your conscious curiosity, and we'll probably be all right. Thank you.